I'd like to introduce our last speaker, Lesley Chamberlain, who's a writer of fiction and an independent scholar who's mostly interested in Russian and German thought. She's been the correspondent for Reuters in Moscow since '78 and started her independent journalistic career in 86? 86, that's right, writing for all the major British newspapers, as well as across the Atlantic Ocean, the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal, if I remember correctly. Pardon? And after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of European communism, she went back to writing fiction, and not only fiction, because she also wrote several books on Eastern and Central European cuisine, which are fascinating. However, her interests in continental thought have produced books about Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, and many more. And today she's going to talk to us about a topic which, to me, runs parallel to the problem of evil mentioned by Richard Conrad. Whether evil is justified in the universe runs parallel to the problem whether morality is justified. And her talk about the Sidgwick's dilemma is precisely on this theme, whether we can justify morality, and if not, what are the consequences for understanding ourselves as human beings. So please give a very warm welcome to our final speaker, Lesley Chamberlain.
I don't. No, sorry, I'm... Yeah. Ray's talk is a hard one to follow, isn't it? I did write down Gertrude's words to Hamlet and noted that I too couldn't accept that we would pass through nature to eternity, and that has that point of view is reflected in my paper, and it's about philosophers finding meaning in our moral lives without the comfort of eternity, and it's a story about British philosophy and its probably certain unwillingness to face up to this problem compared with, say, German philosophy. So Sidgwick's dilemma was that at the end of a long philosophical career, Henry Sidgwick, there is another Sidgwick who's his brother, Henry Sidgwick, who lived from 1834 to 1900, he found that there was no reason for human beings to be moral, with the action that they are on rational explanation of why human beings would feel compelled to be moral. And he hesitated over whether to make his findings public. He wrote on the concluding page of his magnum opus, Methods of Ethics, the first edition, 1874, he wrote, "Hence the whole system of our beliefs in the intrinsic reasonableness of conduct must fall without a hypothesis unverifiable by experience, reconciling the individual with the universal reason, without a belief in some form or other that the moral order that we see imperfectly realized in this actual world is yet actually perfect. If we reject this belief, we may perhaps still find in the non-moral universe an adequate object for the speculative reason capable of being, in some sense, ultimately understood. But the cosmos of duty is thus really reduced to a chaos, and the prolonged effort of the human intellect to frame an ideal of rational conduct is seen to have been foredoomed to inevitable failure." This was quite something to say, actually, in 1874. Now, along with Sidgwick's latest biographer, Bart Schultz, I take this to be a death of God moment. And why perhaps we haven't heard of Sidgwick's crisis in quite these dramatic terms was that he also wasn't really a believer, except that this was a catastrophic moment for him. Now, John Maynard Keynes, who apparently played golf with him, he must have been very young, said of Sidgwick that he never did anything but wonder whether Christianity was true, proving that it wasn't, and hoping that it was. He worried about the gap at the heart of his thinking, but as Keynes also observed, Sidgwick lacked intensity. Chaos loomed, the wages of virtue might be dust, but Sidgwick didn't go through spiritual agony himself. There was no intimate dark night of the soul. Further, he thought if he could have evidence of life after death, this would solve the matter. So here is Sidgwick towards the end of the 19th century, thinking that he could have the faith of Gertrude 300 years earlier, if only he could prove that there was life after death. There was some continuity between nature and eternity. He went in for seances and all sorts of strange things, odd for a philosopher. But he invested everything he had in this belief in the possibility of life after death. Sidgwick's most personal worry that he confessed to was actually hypocrisy. This is a very English position, I have to say. He felt that someone as sceptical as he was ought not to be teaching ethics, because ethics was so closely bound up with belief in God. Schultz tells us that Sidgwick detected, quote, a moment of monumental significance for Western civilization, a potential cataclysm in his intimation of chaos. But Sidgwick's, at best, theistic position was entirely socialized into a concern for the protected social fabric of England. A Dostoevsky-like utterance, if there is no God, then all is permitted. Dostoevsky didn't actually say that, apparently, but he expressed that sentiment. So the sentiment, if there is no God, then all is permitted, might, for Sidgwick, damage the philosophical heart of an England at the height of its worldly power, but didn't actually damage the individual soul. So I think Schultz was right in the case of this English philosopher who arrives at the death of God to mention, but not to press, the Nietzschean parallel. The 1870s and the 1880s did witness this extraordinary outburst of loss of faith across different Christian cultures in and on the edge of the West. But national philosophical and spiritual habits had an overriding influence on the intensity with which it was expressed. Between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and Sidgwick, there is no comparison. Sidgwick mourned the death of God because his good order of things was the empire. Dostoevsky flirted with what metaphysical anarchy would permit in the dark hearts of human individuals corrupted by centuries of political brutality. Nietzsche, meanwhile, a great inward German, expressed the loss of God with unparalleled personal intensity. He was the madman who had lost God and was still looking for him when no one else cared. I'm going to read you the long passage from Nietzsche because it is so fantastic. This is from the book Die fröhliche Wissenschaft. It's translated these days as The Gay Science, and for lots of reasons I just don't find that the right title. So for me, this book is called The Science of Joy, and I think that conveys its flavour. If you know German, Die fröhliche Wissenschaft. So since there were right there a lot of people standing around who didn't believe in God, he made them burst out laughing. Has he got lost then, said one. Has he wandered off like a child, said another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he set sail for somewhere? Has he emigrated? They were all shouting and laughing amongst themselves. The madman sprang into their midst and gave them a hard look. Where has God gone? He cried. I'll tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how did we do it? How did we manage to drink the ocean dry? Who gave us a sponge to wipe the entire horizon away? What did we do when we untethered the earth from its sun? Where is the earth headed now? Where are we headed? Away from all suns? Don't we keep tripping over, backwards, sideways, forwards, to every side? Is there still an above and below? Are we not fumbling our way through an endless nothing? Doesn't an empty room waft towards us? Has it not got colder? Night and more night keep coming, surely. Don't we have to light the lamps already before noon? Have we heard nothing of the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? Can't we smell anything of divine rotting? God rots too. God is dead. God will stay dead, and we have killed him. How will we comfort ourselves, we murderers of all murderers? the most holy and powerful being that the world possessed until now, bled to death from our knives. Who will wipe us clean of this blood? With what water can we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what holy games will we have to invent? Isn't the size of this deed too big for us? Mustn't we ourselves become gods in order to appear in any way worthy of it? There never was a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, at whatever time, belongs in a higher history than all history before, because of this deed. And yet, of course, besides this magnificent outpouring of metaphysical sorrow and mourning, there was a problem behind it for sober philosophy, which Nietzsche well acknowledged. With his lifelong concern to justify duty as a morally superior pursuit to individual happiness, the supposed utilitarian Sidgwick also felt it. He veered constantly towards the Kantian imperative that there was a non-rational reason that we would intuit and we would do our duty by the moral law. But Sidgwick couldn't anchor himself there. And given the inadequacy of utilitarianism to capture the voluntary impulse, moral philosophy itself seemed dead in the water. Now, Nietzsche thought just that. In his multi-layered passage in The Science of Joy that I was just reading, he kills off the entire Socratic moral tradition when, unlike Socrates, going down to the Piraeus to observe the festival and defining virtue by means of agreeable conversation, his Nietzschean madman goes down to the marketplace only to find a jeering public. Not only is human thought no longer tethered to reason, but the earth itself has become unhinged. And the only way an individual who sees nothing but spiritual incoherence can survive is to become a god himself, thus to create his own order of superabundant substitutes for the old faith. To repeat, there's nothing like this, I think, in the English tradition as a visceral experience of the condition of moral philosophy, still closely tied to theology and having to face unbelief towards the end of the 19th century. But I want to look today at two attenuated British responses to the death of God within philosophy, neither of them proposing that we should continue to mourn that death, but providing strikingly different answers, why not? And further, because they both respond to Sidgwick, they suggest an especially interesting comparison with each other. I'll talk a little bit about both Alasdair MacIntyre and Bernard Williams, and I describe their responses as attenuated, both because they were written a full century after Nietzsche and because neither announced his intention as such. MacIntyre's After Virtue was published in 1981, and Williams' Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy in 1985. Coincidentally, both men were the same age, born in 1929, and these books, respectively, were their greatest work. And I must say, reading them, it made me think that the 1980s might turn out to be a very rich decade in our philosophy. Let me start with what they had to say about Sidgwick's dilemma, whether to confess to the chaos he had found in the place of the divinely assured good order of things. MacIntyre's sympathy could hardly be for a perplexed member of the late Victorian intellectual elite, aghast at his social responsibility. MacIntyre was a Marxist when he first encountered Sidgwick, and has remained throughout his career a post-Marxist optimist about human nature. But he felt very keenly that loss of metaphysical guarantee of moral being, and this led to his letting the elitist Sidgwick very kindly off the hook. He wrote, "No philosopher expressed the moral situation of 19th century England, and to some extent we are still in the 19th century." This was 1966, I think he wrote this. "To some extent we are still in the 19th century, better than Henry Sidgwick. Sidgwick is a touching figure whose defects are usually the defects of his age. He was preoccupied with the loss of his own Christian faith in a way that is foreign to us. His moral psychology is crude because the psychology of his time was crude." End of quote. The books central to MacIntyre's career, from the Riddell Lectures of 1964, published 3 years later as Secularization and Moral Change, to A Short History of Ethics, 1966, from which I was just quoting, to After Virtue, 1981, constructed an extraordinary scenario to make felt that loss of Christian faith that Sidgwick endured and McIntyre then tried to explain and to see beyond that crisis, not to mourn it and to see beyond it. Contemporary fear of a nuclear holocaust helped generate in McIntyre an imagined secular event equivalent to the death of God. The preface to After Virtue referred to a, quote, moral calamity, unquote, and the opening chapter referred repeatedly to a catastrophe in which the whole order of meaning which underpinned the moral life of a society and a country had been wiped out. The verb lament was not misplaced. The task of the present age was to reconstruct a meaningful order piecemeal, with the enormous difficulty that the terms rescued from the past had lost their context and were lifeless. The catastrophe, he told us, was only belatedly shadowed by philosophy. The actual disaster was the change in British society consequent on industrialisation and urbanisation. These had generated antagonistic social classes where there was once community and set the false religion of liberal individualism in motion. This is McIntyre saying this. Now, Sidgwick was no working-class hero, but McIntyre admired him because his feeling for the catastrophe was social, and his crisis reflected the decline of religious authority in society as a consequence of those profound economic shifts. Though he laboured under enormous social regret, it was nevertheless not McIntyre's own psychology to mourn, nor, unlike Nietzsche, whose individualism he despised, was he prone to giving the catastrophe personal expression. McIntyre was, by nature and conviction, a social builder and rebuilder along Marxist-influenced lines. He wrote in the closing pages of After Virtue that, like Marx, he was an optimist, but the way ahead, evidently the best way for him would be communitarian or at least communal. The way ahead wouldn't be easy, to rebuild that world of shared moral values. McIntyre was and is, I think, an idealist with a capital I, passionately in search of re-enchantment through a marriage of ideologies that retain faith in human moral potential. His first book, written at least at the age of 23, though it was published later, was Marxism and Christianity. Marxism and Christianity. He always wanted to adhere to both. And in the 1968 preface to that book, he claimed to have become sceptical of his early goal, finding the modern church inadequate and the worldly instantiations of Marxism a travesty. But his career seems founded upon that marriage of Marxism and Christianity in a general sense, even now. A few years after the first publication of After Virtue, McIntyre became a Thomist and accepted that the teleology of human action flowed from a metaphysical foundation in the nature of the human person. So effectively, in my terms, secular terms, he'd gone back to Kant. And he remains now an ardent critic of liberal individualism. That's his continuing Marxist strain, I suppose. On the Christian side, McIntyre would like to live in a world in which his preoccupation with losing his faith and finding it again, I think this is really important, that whole business of losing faith would not be foreign to us. In a sense, we could go on mourning it. I hope this comes through this otherwise secular paper about secular thinkers. They want somehow to acknowledge in their secular philosophy that there is something to mourn about the loss of faith. So McIntyre would like to live in a world in which his preoccupation with losing his faith and finding it again would not be foreign to us, but part of the ongoing spiritual reconstruction of everyday living. It would not be a matter of ongoing mourning, but of taking seriously Sidgwick's touching and foundational dilemma. What are we to do that we can't find a compelling reason for being moral? Now, Bernard Williams, whose career ran in extraordinary parallel to McIntyre, as I say, they were both born in the same year, took a very different path as a moral philosopher. At first glance, he seems intensely scornful of Sidgwick, lambasting Sidgwick's, quote, government house utilitarianism, unquote, lambasting it as craven, stuffy, and shallow. The old man's esoteric morality, keeping secret what could not, without too great a political risk, be disclosed to the simple people, belonged to an obsolete colonialism. Williams, in other words, set himself up not as an idealist like McIntyre, but as a fearless 1960s social liberal in opposition to the late Victorian hypocrite. And yet Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, 1985, a reprise of Sidgwick's Dilemma, becomes Williams' own quietly impassioned answer to the death of God. It is a great book in which the reference to Nietzsche comes rightly before the reference to Sidgwick. Already in the 3rd chapter, Williams tells us, Nietzsche's saying God is dead can be taken to mean we should now treat God as a dead person. We should allocate his legacies and try to write an honest biography of him, unquote. One wonders, had Williams been a writer, whether he would not have tried to write that story. He did incidentally see his rival McIntyre as a writer of intellectual history, not a philosopher. The life of God was a story, and now they were contending new tales to try to explain humanity's shifting moral potential. And Williams was caught up in that, and I have this feeling that if he'd been a writer, he would have written it in a different form. And he's kind of, the philosophy strains somewhat in that way, and it's what helps to make this a great book. But you might also say that mourning is not appropriate for Williams because God died 100 years ago, and I was interested in what Ray was saying about, that there must be some limits to our mourning, but this is a little facetious. Freud actually says that one definition of neurotic for him is the man who, on arriving at Charing Cross Station, falls to his knees and weeps for the death of Queen Eleanor. And this is neurotic. There is some limit. So I'm saying that Williams is not neurotic for the death of God. Come back though for a moment to Williams's reprise of Sidgwick's Dilemma. His question: who will tell the story of the demise of moral philosophy as an absolute code of morality from which we can deduce all obligation and blame? Who will tell this story as a story of the death of God? Measuring himself implicitly against Sidgwick and with Nietzsche, Williams sees himself as having been Nietzschean dynamite in his profession in this respect. He is not afraid to say repeatedly that no rational certainty is available in ethics, such that philosophy could build a tenable theory upon it. For Williams, the death of God coincides with and co-names the death of philosophy as being capable of delivering ethical theory. This is his argument, and I do believe it's effective. For the kind of thinker Sidgwick was when ethical theory ran parallel to a belief in God, this thinking was, quote, transcendental to life, existing in a space quite outside the practice it is supposed to regulate or justify. The past motivation for this may have been very metaphysical and general, lying, for instance, in the idea that we consider the world as it really is only when we see it from the outside, sub specie aeternitatis. Some of the rational dignity ascribed to trying to see the ethical world from that point of view seems to derive from such conception of objectivity. So in a way, Sidgwick, as I said just now, was still doing philosophy in the spirit of Gertrude talking to Hamlet 300 years on. But this is what's coming to an end, and this is what moral philosophy has to contend with, Williams is suggesting. The story Williams is telling, and as I just suggested, is engaging something in a suppressed way, something that he can't tell, namely what it really means to us in our everyday lives, in the texture of those lives which are not not accounted for by any theory that's metaphysical and general, by any generalization. And I'll come on to talk about that psychologically towards the end of the paper. So Williams feels that his story is to show up attitudes incorporated in philosophical arguments, to show up those attitudes as resting on myths and on falsehoods about what people are like. And that in turn turns into his positive project for us to say with greater confidence what people are like, and at the same time to take in to our account of what people are like a far greater diversity than philosophy ever risked before. Williams says, as society has become more and more self-reflective as to what people are really like, there is that need to reallocate God's legacies. And I think this is Williams's project to do that. To say what it feels like to reallocate God's legacies in our world, where we know people differently from the kind of official 19th century morality presented them. The story that Williams is telling intertwines with the theory. In his chapter 6, Williams must say what was wrong with Sidgwick's and indeed Kant's intuitionism. And he asks the question, how can an eternal truth provide a practical consideration? The practical life is too complex to be accounted for by simplifications from on high. Williams's text also wraps itself around a vision of future possibilities. Again, in his 6th chapter, he mentions transparency as a modern ideal of how society should function, implicitly in contrast with Sidgwick's elitism. He notes that liberals and non-liberals will agree with him, at least he feels so, and he appeals to, quote, any who retain radical hopes born of the Enlightenment and to those who do not. And he notes that many Marxist theories embody versions of this transparency in the aim for a society that can do without false consciousness. So there is ground on which our two eminent 20th century British moral philosophers, after the death of God, can meet. And one can see Williams is indeed working on the same problems as McIntyre, namely the problem of moral authority, of Marxism as a rival and or replacement for Christianity, and in respect of competition between these two in the mid-20th century, looking already forwards to a new openness that would be the best outcome, Hegelian fashion, subsuming both. Presumably that's more or less where we are now. He says that Sidgwick was a sort of final kiss of death. Sidgwick was a masochist who proceeded with a certain dry relish to close down the diversity we now work with. Since Sidgwick's time, who we have become is much more complex, and therefore, quote, the aim of ethical thought is to help us to construct a world that will be our world, one in which we have a social, cultural, and personal life. Now you can hear a strong allusion to Nietzsche there as Williams answers the death of God. He says, our ethical arguments have to be grounded in a human point of view. They cannot be derived from a point of view that is no one's point of view at all. Williams insists on a Nietzschean complication of the human, which does not fall under a single definition. He reaches the emphatically unsocratic conclusion, moreover, in his 7th and 9th chapters, that reflection can destroy ethical knowledge. The surprisingly sympathetic allusion here is surely to Heidegger, and it might also embrace the anti-individualistic communitarian ambitions of McIntyre. It is because reflection can indeed destroy ethical knowledge that certain thinkers try to legitimate the return of a simpler, God-fearing society in our complex times. This is chapter 9. Our way of seeing things has indeed brought about Entzauberung, the disenchantment of our days. And the left, the political left, should understand the political right here, that this concern with Entzauberung is of major importance, major moral importance. And the left, the liberal left, should understand the right here without condoning extremism. Now, I won't set out Williams' project further. I would only add something which, in his original remark on Sidgwick, McIntyre also feared, that with the death of God, there are psychological states, perhaps lost to us forever. Future generations will not know from mere words what it was like for a man or woman to lose their faith. At the heart of after virtue, as McIntyre writes, we cannot do with Christianity in the modern world, but we often cannot do without it either, because we have no other vocabulary in which to raise certain kinds of questions about the passing of loved ones, for instance, about our own mortality. In this way, says McIntyre, we are unable to respond to the facts of death, unquote. Open another quote. This is one of the great cultural and social gaps in our lives. Close quote. McIntyre is not asking for a revival of what he calls hellmongering, but, quote, the fact is contemporary Christianity says nothing, he underlines that, nothing about death. Again, this is writing in the 60s. Williams is attuned to this loss too when he notes in passing that the notion of grace will become unintelligible. Philosophy will have left a record of what it was to judge people for their actions, moral philosophy, but no one except a Christian within that past value system will know the effect of believing in God's forgiveness of saints and sinners alike. In the story of the reallocation of God's legacies, the teller of this story, I don't know if he's out there, she is out there, the teller would help us understand these feelings. And they might indeed be continuing emotional possibilities that the person who could tell the story of the reallocation of God's legacies would explain how they could still be part of our dialogue with ourselves. And if they can't be, that person telling that story would explain to us why we should want to mourn those feelings that we can't have anymore. But who can this teller be? How do we write the history of emotions that are no longer felt or have such different names that it is difficult or impossible to recognize them as also having a past context? There are feelings no longer felt, and presumably they are like the dried up twig that evolution has passed by. And who saves dried up twigs when the main body of the plant is raging? In fact, in a neglected work also of the 1980s, the psychologist Antonys Store observed something of the parallel death of solitude with the death of God. He evoked solitude as making possible a certain inwardness and intensity which might be named by some as a relationship with God or a friendship with Jesus. Such a relationship was felt to surpass all others. The person who befriended God was less demanding of and reliant upon his actual human relationships, and may even have lacked those relationships. Such a person often felt himself, herself, to be more creative in that silently comforted inwardness. Now, this complex of beliefs linking God, solitude, and creativity belonged to what seems now to have been a past way of being human, something to mourn. Historically, friendship and love were actually another answer to Sidgwick's fear of moral chaos. The Bloomsbury group, bolstered by Moore's Principia Ethica, was sure that the emotional quality of subjective experience would be enough to compensate for the lack of a metaphysically ordained objective order of goodness and meaning. And just to retain the symmetry of the post-God picture, it might well be said that there was something sub-Nietzschean about the Bloomsburys themselves in their eager discovery of moral individualism or amoralism, and something in fact still Sidgwickian about them in that their freedom was reserved for their social class. Williams, although not free from this spirit of liberal individualism, didn't find this answer enough. And as for McIntyre, he was not impressed by Keynes representing the Bloomsbury attitude. Furthermore, when the cult of human love that the Bloomsburys claimed to instantiate, when that cult of human love and human relationships worked its way forward into the liberal theology of the 1960s, McIntyre found it totally vacuous. He didn't think at all that that could replace these more profound feelings that were associated with a belief in God, and which then affected moral being here. So one chapter of the story of After God might then become the tale of the rise of an obsession with human relationships, accompanied by a fall-off of spiritual intensity. Latterly, if I can speak for an imagined McIntyre here, that chapter would recount the commodification even of friendship, which we see all around us in the post-industrial digitalized world, and the story of a new kind of hypocrisy, alleging that all shall be well. But McIntyre can't tell the whole story because he has returned to the church. And so I have mainly confined myself to Bernard Williams, whose landmark, Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, sets out the after God situation with a sober optimism. One value both Williams and McIntyre agree upon is the shape of a whole life. If you like, that's their answer to the problem of our deaths. And it's not facile in the way they treat it. So the shape of a whole life matters. McIntyre finds the prospect of how to exercise judgment upon our lives difficult because, quote, we are uncertain what it is to live well or badly, unquote. McIntyre needs God to judge. Compare this with Williams' insistence that a possible future ethics, not a morality, but a way of answering ourselves as to our own moral possibilities. A possible future ethics will be confidently concerned with that shape of an individual life, besides bringing the same confidence, and this is really Williams's argument that we still have to have a kind of spiritual confidence, even though we don't have ultimate authorities to turn to. So for Williams, what matters is the shape of an individual life and truth and truthfulness. So you can see there, this is philosophy at its best, I think, paying tribute to the death of God. Thank you.